Welcome back to Previously on Pod. This is Gracie, and today our topic is why you're Team Logan even though Jess and Rory are soulmates. So today I purposefully want to talk about Jess and Rory as an item, and then over here to the side, Logan. Not so much a comparison between, Team Logan versus Team Jess, because from a narrative standpoint, I'm pretty convinced that Team Jess is the right answer, and yet I've been Team Logan all along. And so this video is for those of you who are like me, who, for various reasons, are Team Logan in Gilmore Girls or Team so-and-so in whatever other show. You're in the minority, and you're not really sure why. This video is about you. It's about me. Why certain romantic pairings or certain characters in especially coming of age shows, especially ones that are centered around relationships and romance, why they actually reflect back a lot more about the viewer than they do about the narrative and the storyline. So let's get into it. Okay, so I love Gilmore Girls. It's fall. I'm thinking about what kind of video to do next, and it just feels like the right answer. I've always been interested in this idea of Rory as a character because I think she was a real product of her time. So I think naturally the romantic partners that she was written to have in the show are also sort of a product of the time. You get Dean, the, all-American kid, then the boy next door, right? You get Jess, the bad boy, the angsty one, misunderstood, right? That's another just popular trope that you see a lot in these coming-of-age shows. And then there's Logan. I don't think he fits as neatly into that high school stereotype, so that's going to be maybe another point that we dissect. But he is, I guess, like the fun, adventurous boyfriend, the one that gets maybe the plot moving. A lot of plot points happen. I think the show maybe never intended to have Logan be a romantic partner for Rory for as long as they did. I mean, he's by far her most consistent boyfriend, I guess. I mean, in terms of I think amount of seasons that they're together, amount of time that they're dating, he's the longest. And I think perhaps that's because he helps move the plot along quite a bit. He fits within the construct of the story really well, as opposed to just being like this outside trope that Rory was going to experience. He's just kind of like a part of the Gilmore Girls world. And so we'll get into maybe why that is. But I thought this was so interesting because, generally the writers want you to side with them. I think there are certainly cases where you're supposed to, duke it out and it's like this team versus this team and you're supposed to see all sides. But I think generally the writers write the story a certain way. And when it comes to characters like Rory and Jess, you can kind of analyze the plot and say, okay, Lorelai and Luke are this pair that is destined to be together. And Rory and Jess are sort of a mini version of that. And I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, Logan is like her Christopher and Jess is like her Luke. And that really makes a lot of sense from a narrative standpoint. So why did I never root for Jess? I think there's a couple reasons. One, I think a lot of these coming of age shows are really meant to reflect back to the viewer what they want to see in their own life. Here's what I mean by that. Have you noticed that a lot of the times these coming of age stories are the main character's heavily criticized for having no personality, for having no morals, for being stupid, right? These are some of the common complaints I see, against Rory as a character. I'm thinking of The Summer I Turned Pretty because, of course, it's always been on my mind the last, several months. Belly is critiqued for these same things. I'm even thinking back to those dystopian books that were very much coming-of-age stories, not like solely focused on the romance or the relationship building, but you could see the parallel, I would think, to like Katniss or characters like her. Where there's a pushback because this character doesn't feel like a real person. They feel like a person who makes plot decisions. They don't feel like someone that has necessarily like inherent preferences. And I think that's actually very crucial. So I was talking to my husband, Matt, about this, and Matt is also part of Field Guide. He makes, sports videos. And so I feel like his realm of media revolves around sports. And so we were talking about it, and he was like, well, it's interesting because a lot of sports movies are very formulaic. And I think there's a really easy criticism against something like Gilmore Girls, which is often called a soap opera. That is kind of formulaic also, right? Like, these people have to get into a fight so that this happens. It's not reinventing the wheel in terms of storylines. They're pretty basic. And that doesn't mean I don't like them. I enjoy watching them, but it feels form-wise pretty consistent. Like, it's especially during the 2000s, this nostalgia TV time, form was something that there was not a lot of wiggle room, right? These were playing on a TV channel that had certain requirements for what the scenes, how the length of scenes, the segments looked like. And so I can only imagine that impacted the way they wrote it. That being said, okay, there's these formulaic type setups. When you're watching a sports movie, I don't really know many people putting themselves in the role of that athlete, right? It's just not attainable. It's not relatable. And yet, when you're watching something like Gilmore Girls, putting yourself in the role of Rory feels really natural. And it's easy for me to say that because I feel like I grew up watching Rory, and so maybe there's something to that where you put yourself in the role of somebody who you're watching in really formative age. However, I don't think that's all there is to it. I think something about a coming of age show in and of itself is asking the viewer to grow up with the show, even if you're already of age. And that's why The Summer I Turned Pretty, I think, has been so fun, because people who are not teenagers watch it and feel that same sense of nostalgia. So I actually don't really think it's age dependent. I think it's more about you get to be the main character when you watch a coming of age story. And many coming of age stories like Gilmore Girls are centered around relationships and relationship building. And therefore, when we get to this idea of teams, Team Rory, or Team Jess, Team Logan, Team Dean, the reason why this is so central to the plot is because if Rory isn't really a character, if she doesn't have a whole lot defining her, then what she is a person who builds relationships. And I do that. And I could be in the world of Gilmore Girls, right? I could be making these same decisions. This is something that could happen in my life, right? It's not happening. My life's more boring, sure, but it could be happening. And I think that's something really unique that a lot of nostalgia TV shows, I'm realizing, do. It's a blessing and a curse, right? A lot of people don't like that, but it's got to be this mix of, it's not just all romance novels do this, because I don't think every romance book puts you in the role of kind of being the heroine, because there's some romance stories that are lovely and they just do not feel at all relatable to real life. They're very specific stories about specific characters. In the same way, I don't think all coming of age stories do this, because I was thinking about some of my favorites. So The Way, Way Back, it's actually up here if you can see it right here. That's my favorite movie. It's a coming of age story about this really quirky, socially awkward 14-year-old boy. And when you're watching him relationship build, there's no me putting myself in his shoes, right? I don't want to do that. He's too specific. He's too real, right? That character feels like a real person, and therefore it just is not reflective of my life. It wouldn't make sense for me to put myself in their shoes. Same thing with Cha Cha Real Smooth, if you've ever seen that movie. It's, again, kind of a play at a nostalgia. I feel like the idea of the movie is very nostalgic, but it's a specific main character, and it really has a specific message that I think is unique to the movie. And I don't feel like that about Gilmore Girls. I don't feel like there's a specific message. I feel like it's about a young girl and her mom navigating relationships, and that is very relatable to a large group of people. And so it's something about that combo of coming of age and romance, relationship, soapy type shows. And I think Gilmore Girls is a great example of this. So let's talk a little bit more about Logan. For me personally, I do think a lot of this has to do with preference. I think you see somebody on the screen, and I talk about this a lot with nostalgia TV shows, they're intentionally picking people that look like this aspirational way, right? They're choosing these really pretty people to be put on the screen so that you want to watch that because you want that to be your life. And while you're watching it, you get sucked in. You might actually think for a minute that is your life, and that's where those feelings are coming from, why you care so much. I think that's certainly a part of it. I also think that Logan represents this kind of next stage in Rory's life where it's no longer her as a high school student in her safety net, but she's kind of moved on from that and expanded out to be a larger person. And this is so funny because this is when her character gets the most criticism. This is when she starts making the most mistakes. And coincidentally, that's the relationship in the show that I'm the most interested in. So part of that might just be preference, but I also think there's something to be said about you're just choosing the person you would want to be with, right? Like, yeah, Rory, it makes sense that she wants to be with Jess because in the show we learn that Rory loves reading books and she's super passionate about that. Well, when Rory's on the screen, do I see her reading books? Yeah, for like a second. There's like a shot of her reading, but that is really not her character to me, right? Her character to me is someone who is figuring out relationships. That's what she's doing 99% of the time she's on the screen, and that's something that I can relate to. So once again, it's not really about Rory as a person, because Rory as a person, I feel like makes a lot of sense with Jess. She's very much a people pleaser, and he's not, and they balance each other out in that way. Whereas when you see on paper Rory and Logan, well, they both are kind of burdened by the expectations of their wealthy families. It doesn't feel like they're necessarily making each other better people. But when I watch the relationship on screen, I'm thinking, well, that looks more fun. That looks more endearing to me. Whereas when I'm looking at Rory and Jess, I see there's a larger narrative arc that maybe the show was interested in that maybe didn't play out. I'm going to link a video below. But I was watching another creator and it was just so timely because I was thinking about making this video and she literally made a video talking about why Rory and Jess are endgame, why they are the couple of the show. And she was really convinced that it was the writer's intent all along for them to be together, for them to come back together, but it just didn't quite pan out with the storytelling. And I'm very intrigued by that idea because I think that makes a lot of sense. And that also kind of leads me to, well, then why were Rory and Logan together for so long? And I really do think that relationship generated a lot of new plot points in this college era of her life, in this kind of adult making era of her life. And I think for a show that's meant to be, episodic, like it's coming out every week and people are, this generates a little bit of buzz. You got to keep people engaged all throughout, 24 episodes throughout a whole season. It would make sense to me that maybe you would privilege plot over an overall beautifully constructed narrative because it's a TV show. And especially during the 2000s, TV shows were not necessarily having full creative control over when their story would end. And so it would make sense that they would want to keep a character like Logan around who was able to be generating a lot of plot, not like making Rory a better person. But I feel like when we think about our own lives, we don't always think about it in terms of a narrative, right? I'm not thinking like, well, let me zoom out and look at all of the decisions that I've made and kind of who that makes me as a person and what's the kind of person that would get me there. I think it's a really nice way of thinking about like being intentional about the people in your life, but I just don't see many people doing that, especially when you're engaging with something like TV show. Like it's kind of meant to be fun and entertaining. So yeah, I think from a narrative standpoint, Rory and Jess absolutely belong together. They make sense as a couple, but the story strayed so far from that connection, and Rory as a person, I don't think was that strong of a character. If she had this strong bend of what she was going to pursue, then yeah, she would have made her way back to Jess, right? Because she would have been a writer or at least more attached to her ideals than a lifestyle of like a rich, college academic, whatever you want to call her time at Yale. But really, a lot of this writing and Yale and school and reading, all those were plot points that got her to the next stage. And so it feels like I'm saying it's careless. I'm not trying to say that the writing was careless. I don't think it was. In fact, I do think it makes sense that in a lot of ways Jess mirrors the groundedness that Luke gives Lorelai. I think there is that for Rory and Jess. I just don't think it really came to fruition. And I think that's okay. I think you can say, like, on paper, that's the right choice. But for me, I would rather watch Logan on the screen. And that's kind of personal preference. That's because when I put myself into the story, I want to and wanted to, as a young person, be someone who went away to college and had all these new experiences and met somebody who had a totally different lifestyle than me, who could show me new things, right? You know what I mean? Like, that's also very understandable and very normal. And I think it's funny because when people talk about a TV show, you know, you're kind of it's in this guise of like the narrative of the world the writers have built, and yet almost from the time that they push that show out, that narrative is not like it's in its pure state, right? Because it's being interacted with all these different people who are going to interpret it in different ways and put their own life into the story. And so I think when it comes to Logan, I think he's such a fun character because I actually think he exists on his own as a character without Rory. And I think that's pretty rare as a boyfriend. Now, I'm not going to make any claims that Dean and Jess don't do this in the story. It feels kind of clear that Dean doesn't, okay? It feels as though his character is like kind of two-dimensional. Like he shows up when there's a plot point that concerns Rory and then he goes away. Jess, I feel less like this. I think he has ties to the story outside of Rory. However, because he was brought on, I think, to be a love interest, right? Like he was brought in for that specific purpose, that when that story played itself out, he didn't have anywhere else to go. They just didn't set it up to where him and Luke had something fully separate. My favorite Jess moments are of him and Luke, and when it's kind of more about their family dynamic and how that in some ways mirrors or contrasts Lorelai and Rory. I think that's really cool, and I love that. But we just don't get a ton of it because, again, I do think he's brought in to be Rory's boyfriend. Logan is brought in to be Rory's boyfriend, but I don't think to the same narrative extent. You know what I mean? I don't think he's there to like show some larger feature about Rory. This could be denied, right? Because then most people would say, no, he's kind of the sign that she's going downhill and that she's becoming superficial. I just don't know if that's fully supported. I think that would work for like the first part of the relationship, but then they kept him around for like another year in the show where he's just kind of like her partner and he's doing things with her, and it's less about, you know, his kind of party lifestyle and how it influences her, and it becomes more of, you know, Rory and Logan are doing long distance and he's starting a job and she's still doing this or that, and it kind of starts to feel like he's his own character with his own plot points. Again, like the episode where she goes to visit like his work friends in London or something like that really was a moment that it made it click for me, where I thought, I just can't imagine Rory going into Jess in his life or Dean in his life. That just doesn't seem to really happen. Whereas Logan's family and friends were always a central part of his character. It was never just what he could do for Rory. And so in a way, even though I feel like his character has, or their relationship might have less substance in some ways than Jess and Rory, it feels like that made him, to me, stand alone as a character more. I was interested in what he had to say, and I didn't really care if he was with Rory or not necessarily. I just wanted to see him on the screen. Whereas if Jess was on the screen, you know, he should be with Rory. That's what made the most sense. Even though I did care about him as a separate character, it just feels like for whatever reason the writers didn't write him to kind of have his own story. And I really feel like they gave that to Logan, and I'm not sure why. And I'm curious what a lot of people who aren't Team Logan feel. I would imagine they just probably don't watch a lot of the later seasons because he's in so much of them. And I really liked it. And I think there is something to be said about a coming-of-age story where you get to kind of play like that. I mean, it's almost like playing dress up, or it's some sort of idea that a story, like, not like fourth wall, but almost that, right? That, like, I'm not just watching this story because I love East Coast small town stories, even though maybe I do, and maybe I'm, like, into Hallmark and all this kind of stuff. No, it's something about the relationship dynamics that speak to me, and that's okay. They can speak to me, like, specifically, and I can have specific opinions about what a good or fun or interesting, compelling relationship looks like, and it actually doesn't really need to match the main character all that much. And this was something that was surprising to me, and I think is why a lot of those main characters, especially the young teenage girl sort of main characters, get so much hate. Because if I was in that position, I would do it differently. Well, it's a story. But at the same time, we feel compelled to make it not a story and to make it meaningful for us. I wonder what this also says just about like meaning making and people wanting relationships. Like, is something about seeing it on the screen so satisfying because you're not having to like do that work yourself? You're just getting to watch somebody else do that work. Like, do we just really like that? You know, like reality TV shows are such a big thing right now. We like watching people try and make connections in the safety of our own home. And maybe that's always what a narrative has been from the get-go. But I do really love something about a coming of age story where it feels like you're able to be learning with that character and you're able to feel very close to them in a way that when I watch a sports movie or when I watch a movie where there's like an incredibly niche topic, I'm thinking of like Marty Supreme's coming out. Like there's going to be rare occasion where I'm going to actually feel like I can relate to that story on a very simple level. And I think coming of age stories offer that on a silver platter, especially when the idea of relationships are presented because everyone is relating with everybody in some way. And so I would say I'm curious what people think when they don't really ascribe to what the writers had in mind. This even makes me think of my video that I made, which I'll link below, a couple weeks ago about The Summer I Turned Pretty, season 3, episode 9, where it was almost like I was like starting to think about these ideas because I was like, I really felt like the writers meant for something else to be the fan reaction. They spent a lot of time on Belly and Jeremiah's breakup and how Jeremiah was coping with it. And I'm thinking, man, after every single episode has come out this season, all I hear people saying is we want more of Conrad and we want more of Belly and Conrad's perspective. And it was like this episode came out and it was the complete opposite of that. And it made me wonder, why do people want something that the writers don't want them to have yet? You know, is that good writing? Is that bad writing? Is that just unpredictable reactions from people? And I think, again, it has more to do with not a narrative and not like a full story that a writer would be trying to tell, but rather like some kind of longing, some kind of relationship that people love to indulge in. And we just kind of say it's a narrative for the sake of it being easier that way. But really what we want is that like a real easy shortcut to that connection that we see on screen. And so when I'm saying I'm Team Logan, I realized it's really not because I think him and Rory are a good fit. It's because I love to see a character on screen that I think is fun to watch and that I think is like an interesting addition to a show that didn't really have a perspective quite like his. And that's something that I think is cool in real life, right? Like that's really what I'm saying, is that I think this is cool in real life. And it's funny how you can draw those connections, and once you start to draw them, you realize it has very little to do with Gilmore Girls, and that's why I've never really concerned myself much with Team Jess. Like, I've never been opposed to him. I'm like, yeah, it makes sense that they were a couple, but I don't like that relationship where, like, they're both, like, kind of moody or sad, or I don't know. Like, that's not interesting to me. That's not a relationship dynamic that I necessarily enjoy watching on the screen, at least not in the context of Gilmore Girls. You know, if it's a coming of age story, then it's my story, right? And my story is not going to be a moody something or other. And that's okay, right? There's something in it for everybody. And maybe that is why the writers kind of tried to have these different tropes, these different camps, because they're trying to get the widest appeal. They want every, young person or every person who's interested in the show to have some buy-in. And I guess, is that unique to television? Does television try to garner a larger audience than a movie? I don't think you could say that. But again, something about coming of age feels like you are trying to cast a wide net. And this is really weird because as somebody who really loves writing and has tried to study writing, the idea is that the more specific you are, the wider your appeal will actually be. So this is supported in the way that like a movie like Marty Supreme or something, I haven't seen it yet, so maybe it's not niche and specific, but it sure as heck looks it. Why a movie like that is probably going to be better received critically than an episode of Gilmore Girls. It's not that it's better, but in being more specific, there's going to be like a more stark human emotion that a viewer can draw from it. Whereas something like Gilmore Girls, we were casting just a wider net of a character who doesn't really have maybe one specific personality, but she's just kind of existing as a girl, is going to maybe draw in a lot of people who want to put themselves in that position as girl. But you may not leave with that same stark human emotion. And maybe that is telling as to why, you know, you could really just pick your favorite boyfriend of the show based on what you like and take that and leave. You can watch those episodes, disregard the ones you don't. You know, it feels like this lower buy-in, but it's also really cool how you get to put yourself into the story. So it's like, I hesitate to say that it's this lesser thing. You know, yeah, maybe it's not winning the same amount of awards, but it's offering you something really different. And I think that's cool too, because these tend to be girl shows, right? I feel like I skate around that a lot because I don't think just girls like coming of age romance shows, but it does feel like the main characters tend to be girls, and it does feel like most of the audience base is. And I feel like it's really easy, again, to like make fun of that or be like, oh, they're just all about relationships. And that's not the whole point of life. But in a lot of ways, relationships kind of are the point of life, like not romantic ones, but just relationships in general. And so the fact that there are all these people who are watching a piece of fiction trying to play at finding real meaning, at least that's what I mean, like that might be a little dramatic, but that's kind of what I'm thinking is happening a lot of times. And I think we downplay it a lot. Oh, Team Logan, Team Jess, whatever, haha. But really, I feel like it's you're doing something really important when you're watching a show like that. And that's what nostalgia is. It's like saying, "Oh, this is me, right? This is something that is connecting back to me. It's not just a beautiful story with a beautiful human emotion. This is me specifically." And for a piece of fiction to be you, I don't know, that's something I'm really interested in, and I want to think about that more. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Really, I would love to hear if anybody has certain teams or certain like takes about a coming of age show, a nostalgia TV show that they feel like are different from most people's, or maybe not even different from most people's, because I think a big thing with nostalgia shows is they've been around for so long that there are a lot of clear different opinions, but rather, you know, did you notice yourself feeling something different than what the writer wanted you to feel, and why do you think that was? So I wonder if it was anything like my experience with Team Logan, or just Logan as a character and loving him versus, you know, Rory and Jess as this narrative couple that kind of in a lot of ways is a whole you know, mirror for the show, right? Like this parallel to Luke and Lorelai. It's like this, it really draws the whole show together. And yet I think fans, especially in a TV show where there are a lot of active fans might matter even more. You look at the Year in the Life, and it feels like a lot of that writing was coming from wanting fans to appreciate a show or just indulge and enjoy and laugh at a show that they loved. It didn't feel like they were trying to craft this perfect end narrative to this show to make full character arcs. So I did not feel like that when I was watching it. I felt like it was just supposed to be fun and entertaining and indulgent, in which case maybe what fans think and how people put themselves into a show is actually become a part of the art in a way that the author or the writer, you know, of the show would have never intended. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks for joining me on Previously On, and I'll see you next time. Bye.